Following Trump's successful 2024 presidential campaign, interest in the 4B movement spiked amongst American women. Suddenly, women all over the internet decided to rethink their relationships with men, specifically after 55% of men voted for a candidate who promised a restricted access to reproductive care and a rollback on protections on bodily autonomy. But that's a whole other debate. Like political lesbianism of the 1970s, the 4B movement can be interpreted through the lens of sextremism. Sextremism is a term that combines sex and extremism and refers to extreme beliefs or actions related to sex, sexuality, or gender that go beyond the norms or boundaries of societal acceptance. It often involves pushing for radical or sometimes controversial views or behaviours to sexual expression or identity. On the other end of this spectrum, we have the actions of internet personas such as Bonnie Blue and Lilly Phillips, which can also be understood as acts of extremism, where individuals will push the boundaries surrounding sex and sexual intimacy. In this video, we're going to look at the origin of these movements, how they link to sextremism, and the potential dangers and impacts it can have on marginalised identities. The 4B, or the 4 No's movement, is a digital feminist movement popular among young women that rejects patriarchal expressions like marriage, children, romance, and sex. The B in the name, echoing the Korean word bi, meaning not, symbolises their rejection of societal norms. Emerging from the economic uncertainty following neoliberal reforms in South Korea, 4B feminists challenge the post-feminist ideals of previous generations, particularly the Sex and the City notion of extended girlhood. They are disillusioned with job insecurity, a stagnant upward mobility, and societal expectations that often leave women economically vulnerable. In response to the failure of traditional feminist groups to address these issues, 4B feminists shifted to digital platforms, highlighting their everyday experiences of fear and frustration as evidence of structural exploitation. Alongside political actions, they also embrace self-help strategies to address economic insecurity, focusing on autonomy beyond traditional values and roles as wives and mothers. The 4B movement intersects with the broader youth issue, particularly the 3PO generation, which gave up marriage, relationships, and children due to intense societal pressure and economic competition. The rise of digital feminism in 2015 intensified gender debates, with feminist groups like Megalians confronting misogyny in daily life and rejecting traditional norms. Events like the government's birth maps in 2016, which basically treated women's bodies like maps for reproduction, completed with a pin in every baby-making milestone, sparked protests and highlighted how women's reproductive roles were politicized. The 4B movement emerged as a response to this, directly challenging the state's pro-natalist policies and rejecting the traditional path of marriage and reproduction as part of the patriarchy. In the context of South Korea's feminization of poverty, 4B feminists critique the economic vulnerabilities pushing women back into marriage as a survival strategy. They stress financial independence and self-reliance, aiming to secure a sustainable life without relying on these patriarchal structures. For example, a feminist YouTube group, Solidarity, emphasizes learning personal finance to maintain a stable life as unmarried women, reflecting the movement's practical focus on autonomy. 4B feminists also take aim at consumerism, labeling it as a distraction, keeping women from long-term financial security. It's like that sneaky devil on your shoulder that's like, you really need that cute handbag, go buy it, go spend all your money on shoes. When in reality, you're just trying to save for your future and you really, really want to be owning a place rather than wasting all your money on rent that's going down the drain. They argue that consumerism pushes women back towards traditional family roles because nothing says independence like buying stuff you don't need just to feel temporarily better about the fact that society's got all these expectations. By rejecting this culture of overconsumption, the 4B movement is showing how patriarchy and consumer capitalism are like the dynamic duo of dependence. Both systems thrive when women are too busy shopping or swiping to focus on securing real long-term financial independence. In other words, they're saying you don't need new shoes, you need financial freedom, which is a lot more rewarding than a shopping spree. Although you might not get that instant dopamine rush. The 4B movement aligns with sextremism by rejecting traditional gender roles and patriarchal control over women's bodies. By choosing to step away from marriage, dating, and reproduction, 4B feminists challenge the systems that rely on women fulfilling family and reproductive roles. Instead, they're advocating for alternatives like financial independence and solidarity, giving women the freedom to choose what works best for them. This resistance to societal pressures around women's sexuality and reproduction is at the heart of sextremism, which also promotes breaking free from restrictive norms and embracing autonomy. So, in short, it's about women making their own decisions without having to conform to outdated expectations. Political lesbianism is the idea that being a lesbian can be a political choice and not solely based on sexual attraction. Emerging in the 1970s within feminist and lesbian movements, it was primarily advocated for by radical feminists as a rejection of heterosexuality, which they viewed as a tool of patriarchal oppression. Political lesbianism not only calls for women to reject sexual relationships with men, but also to withdraw from traditional gender roles as a means of dismantling systems of patriarchy and male privilege. This ideology shares similarities with the 4B movement, as both reject relationships with men as a form of resistance. The term political lesbianism was first popularised by a British feminist theorist, Sheila Jeffreys, in her 1979 book, The Lesbian Revolution. She, along with other radical feminists, emphasised that rejecting heterosexual relationships was essential for women in order to reclaim their independence and challenge male-dominated structures. Adrienne Rich, another prominent voice, expanded these ideas in her 1980 essay, Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence. Rich argued that heterosexuality functions as a system of social control, which she termed compulsory heterosexuality, imposed on women to maintain their subordination. She saw lesbianism as a potential way for women to assert personal autonomy and resist patriarchal constraints, though she did not call for all women to become lesbians. Instead, she encouraged women to reject social pressures towards heterosexuality and consider lesbian relationships as liberating alternatives. While both political lesbianism and the 4B movements critique patriarchy and advocate for rejecting traditional gender roles, they differ in focus and context. Political lesbianism often emphasises lesbian identity and sexuality as resistance, arising from radical feminist critiques of gender and sexual norms in the 1970s. But in contrast, the 4B movement, rooted in contemporary digital culture, emphasises rejecting marriage, motherhood, and relationships with men as part of a broader critique of patriarchal and economic structures. The 4B movement also highlights socio-economic survival, making it more grounded in practical realities than in identity-centred framework of the political lesbianism sphere. Political lesbianism aligns with sextremism in its use of sexuality as a radical political tool to challenge societal norms. Think of it as using your love life to shake things up in a way that makes society sit up and take notice. While sextremism is all about provocative sexual acts to highlight gender inequalities, political lesbianism takes a more subtle but arguably equally as powerful route. Just don't do it. Just don't do heterosexuality at all. Both seek to reclaim women's control over their bodies and sexuality, but they do so in contrasting ways. Sextremism through sexual provocation and performance, and political lesbianism through reframing sexuality as a tool for resistance. Bonnie Blue and Lilly Phillips are OnlyFans creators known for their controversial sexual challenges involving multiple encounters in short time frames. Bonnie Blue gained attention for reportedly engaging with 1,057 men in 12 hours, surpassing Lisa Sparks' 2004 record of 919 men. I, for one, couldn't think of anything worse than that. Lilly Phillips, a former friend, attempted a similar challenge with 101 men in 2024. This sparked a feud between the two over the idea of sleeping with 1,000 men in a day, which Bonnie Blue eventually won. Bonnie has faced backlash in her Bonk Me campaigns, where she targets barely legal college-age guys, as well as her claims that men are entitled to sex from their wives and are justified in cheating because they deserve sex. Critics have labelled her view as perpetuating internalised misogyny and harmful stereotypes. Her rhetoric was slammed for undermining women's autonomy, suggesting that the pinnacle of womanhood is just sexual expression and participation in the adult industry. It's like she missed the memo that some of us women prefer empowerment with a little less publicity. Critiques have also called her out for failing to address the real issues like exploitation in the industry and the systemic problems that go beyond who's bonking who. In 2024, YouTuber Josh Peters released the documentary I Slept with 100 Men in One Day, chronicling Phillips' attempt to break a sexual record. The film depicts her determination, vulnerability, and the emotional aftermath, sparking debate about exploitation, the psychological toll on such acts, and societal pressures within the adult industry. Critics have questioned whether these challenges empower participants or reduce them to commodified spectacles for consumerist systems like OnlyFans and media coverage. Both creators engage in acts that challenge societal taboos around female sexuality. This aligns with the shock factors of sextremism. By participating in extreme sexual acts, they confront the double standards surrounding promiscuity and disrupt traditional gender dynamics by positioning themselves in control. However, critics aren't exactly buying it. They argue that these acts can sometimes turn female bodies into commodities, reinforcing the very objectification and consumerism that sextremism aims to subvert. It's like trying to burn down a store whilst also wearing that store's hoodie. Sure, they're shaking things up and pushing boundaries, but there's a question of whether they're actually adding fuel to the capitalist fire. And nobody said that they're feminists. Nobody said that they were doing this for feminist reasons. While these acts may aim to normalise female sexual autonomy and subvert patriarchal norms, their subversive potential is overshadowed by the capitalist systems that they fuel. Whether these performances are empowering or exploitive ultimately depends on the perspective. Critics of both the 4B movement and sextremism has pointed out a little flaw in their grand plan. While they're great at rejecting traditional norms, they don't always provide a roadmap for what comes next. The 4B movement's no marriage, no kids, no thanks to the patriarchy approach might leave some women thinking, okay, but now what? Sure, they've got rejection down to an art form, but what about building relationships that don't involve the whole patriarchal trap? Or securing financial and economic stability without traditional roots. Similarly, sextremism's focus on sexual liberation as a tool for resistance risks reducing sexuality to performance, potentially leading to objectification and commodification. Both movements may inadvertently create pressure to conform to radical behaviours and ideologies, alienating those whose personal desires or experiences fall outside these frameworks. In their emphasis on rejection, these movements might be forgetting a little something: feelings. Sextremism, for example, is often so focused on tossing traditional relationship structures out the window, it sometimes forgets about the emotional baggage that comes with saying no to everything. Sure, rejecting traditional societal norms sounds great on paper, but what happens when the emotional weight of no marriage, no kids, no traditional roles starts creeping in? This narrow focus can leave individuals feeling disconnected from meaningful relationships involving intimacy and care, leading to instead superficial or transactional connections. The 4B movement has also been accused of a bit of an ironic twist. Despite rejecting heterosexual relationships, marriages, and reproductive expectations, it somehow manages to keep men at the very centre of its narrative. By focusing so much on divesting from men, the movement ends up constantly centering them in the conversation. Resisting is framed around men's influence, which is kind of like saying, we're going to fight against the patriarchy, but first, let's talk about the patriarchy just a little bit more, as if that topic hasn't been explored and talked about on and on and on over the past 20, 30, 40 years. This creates a binary oppositional view of gender and power, which can make it harder to carve out those truly women-centered spaces that don't always need men as a reference point. It's like creating a feminist movement where, ironically, the main character is still the guy that we're not dating. Plus, this focus can leave out people who don't define their identities in terms of opposition to men, like those seeking a more intersectional approach to gender and power. Because, maybe there's a lot more to feminism than just men bad, women good. It's kind of like trying to make a cake with just flour. There's definitely a lot more to it. By centering its critique on men, the 4B movement often risks overlooking aspects of women's lives such as emotional self-sufficiency, care work, and personal fulfillment, without framing them as oppositional to men. The movement also tends to overlook the experiences of women and non-binary people in relationships with men who still face gender oppression. It's almost as if anyone who isn't in a heterosexual relationship with a man can get left out of the conversation, especially in queer contexts that challenge traditional gender narratives anyway. And by defining womanhood so rigidly, the movement might unintentionally exclude the many different ways people experience gender and sexuality. So while they're fighting for women's liberation, they may also be reinforcing transphobia and homophobia by not recognising the diversity of experiences within those who don't fit neatly into the man versus woman binary. An article by Giuseppe Lopez in Them highlights concerns from queer and trans South Korean feminists about how the resurgence of the 4B rhetoric in America could promote anti-trans sentiments. Professor Han from UCLA warns, "I would hate for this interest in 4B outside of South Korea to somehow feed and revive the most regressive part of 4B. I would actually hate for the interest in 4B in the US to then somehow make this TERF movement grow in South Korea." For trans individuals, the 4B movement's blanket rejection of all men, without giving a thought to relationships involving trans men, queer men, or queer women, can sometimes sound a little bio-essentialist. So let's face it, we all know what that leads to: a steaming hot cup of transphobia. It's like saying we reject all men and forgetting that some of these men are also part of the solution, not the problem. One user summed it up very nicely. Unfriendly reminder that the 4B movement, as cool as it seems on the surface, has some seriously deep-rooted TERF vibes. So if you care about trans women in Korea, maybe take that movement with a grain of salt. They are not safe with the 4B movement. And though I don't want to be that person, this way of thinking usually ends up demonising all men. In the context of South Korea, there's definitely a legitimate reason provided to support why women no longer want to be around men. And I think that there's a very similar sentiment in the West too. Whilst it's important to acknowledge that this is a reaction to wider societal issues, not all men are the problem. If Bonnie Blue and Lilly Phillips promote radical sexual ideologies, they may create unrealistic expectations around sexual freedom and behaviour. When these ideas are adopted without a balanced perspective, they can lead to feelings of inadequacy, pressure to meet extreme standards, or even dangerous behaviour. People may feel compelled to push their sexual boundaries in a way that aren't consensual or healthy. Promoting excessive promiscuity or risky sexual behaviour as empowerment might encourage unsafe practices, leading to health risks like STDs, unwanted pregnancies, and emotional harm. And with the debate on reproductive rights in America, as well as the fact that abortion is still a criminal offence in the UK, maybe not the best thing to encourage right now. Sex extremism can sometimes reject traditional relationship structures without offering any viable alternatives. For example, if Blue or Phillips advocate for rejecting monogamy or long-term relationships, they may unintentionally encourage shallow or transactional connections. This can hinder the development of emotionally supportive and lasting relationships. The idea that monogamy or emotional intimacy is oppressive might diminish the desire for meaningful partnerships, leaving people feeling isolated. Sounds like a criticism about the 4B movement, wouldn't you agree? You know, where everything is liberating until you're running in circles wondering where the emotional connections went. If Blue and Phillips engage in sex-positive extremism without prioritising consent and emotional well-being, it could unintentionally turn sex into a buy one get one free deal. Except, spoiler alert, someone's getting shortchanged. When sex becomes a transactional experience, it could lead to exploitation and objectification, especially of vulnerable individuals. Promoting sex work without addressing the ethical, emotional, and physical consequences could inadvertently harm those in the industry, especially those who are there out of necessity or coercion. The idea that consent can be bought may have damaging effects. Extreme forms of sex-positive ideologies, if they ignore these realities, can cause psychological harm. I mean, no wonder Lilly Phillips literally wrote down in her documentary. Individuals might feel pressured to engage in sexual acts they're uncomfortable with, thinking it's part of this freedom culture, when in reality it's more like the emotional equivalent of going skydiving when you're terrified of heights. The result? A lot of emotional distress and sometimes trauma. Interestingly enough, the issues with Bonnie Blue Blue and Lilly Phillips align quite well with my video on raunch feminism and OnlyFans, so if you want to check that out after this video, please feel free to. Political lesbianism, whilst aiming to challenge male dominance by prioritising relationships with women, has been criticised for oversimplifying gender and sexuality and marginalising certain groups. By focusing on personal relationships with men as the source of patriarchy, it neglects the systemic factors like wage inequality, healthcare access, and reproductive rights. Critics argue that rejecting heterosexual relationships as a symbolic act of resistance fails to address deeper systemic issues or provide a framework for building a more inclusive and equitable society. As a form of sextremism, political lesbianism risks reducing women's autonomy to a political statement. By positioning lesbianism as a choice to resist patriarchy, it commodifies and oversimplifies sexuality, potentially undermining the validity of genuine lesbian identities. This view can alienate women who desire heterosexual partnerships or face societal pressures around marriage and family. It's like saying your relationship choices are irrelevant unless they fit the revolution, which, if we're being honest, sounds more like a bad slogan than a good ideology. And by defining women's sexuality in solely oppositional to men, it inadvertently reinforces male-centered narratives, because nothing says empowerment like defining yourself entirely by what you're not. An article from The Queerness critiques this view, stating, "To be a lesbian does not mean to reject men. The very foundations on which this concept of political lesbian rests are lies," highlighting the problematic nature of framing sexuality around rejection rather than attraction or identity. The movement's binary approach, framing all relationships with men as inherently oppressive, reinforces exclusionist ideologies. It's like saying that every time you have a cup of coffee, it's a protest against tea, completely ignoring that some people like both. By doing this, it risks alienating queer women, trans individuals, and those in relationships outside of the cisgender male-female paradigm, which aligns with bioessentialist narratives, often linking to trans-exclusionary radical feminism. As Honeysoint notes, political lesbianism has a history of exclusionary ideologies, emphasising its potential to marginalise individuals who don't fit in its narrow framework. By failing to account for diversity and the fluidity of gender and sexual orientation, political lesbianism can inadvertently replicate the same systems of exclusion and oppression it actually seeks to dismantle. In conclusion, both the 4B movement and political lesbianism provide radical critiques of a patriarchal system, yet they navigate the complexities of gender and sexuality and heterosexual relationships in distinct ways. While these movements offer challenges to a patriarchal structure, they also present potential dangers, particularly when viewed through the lens of sextremism. The actions of figures like Bonnie Blue and Lilly Phillips highlight a lot more extreme iteration of sexual empowerment, one that pushes boundaries through provocative sexual acts that disrupt societal norms but also risks commodifying and objectifying women. Their acts, which are framed as sometimes empowering, can blur the lines between personal liberation and objectification, leaving space for dangerous behaviours and unhealthy expectations around sexuality. The 4B movement, in its rejection of traditional family roles, risks marginalising women who seek intimacy and connection outside of its framework, while political lesbianism can alienate those who don't fit neatly into this binary rejection of men. Both movements, and the sextremism by Blue and Phillips, can focus too heavily on rebellion without offering sustainable, inclusive alternatives, potentially overlooking the emotional, psychological, and practical needs of individuals. Furthermore, these movements risk promoting exclusionary ideologies, inadvertently reinforcing new systems of oppression, such as transphobia, or the objectification of women's bodies in the pursuit of radical sexual liberation. Ultimately, while the 4B movement and political lesbianism contribute important perspectives to feminist discourse, their relationship with sextremism must be critically examined. By focusing on extreme acts of resistance, these movements may overlook the diverse ways people experience gender and sexuality and empowerment. A more inclusive, nuanced, and intersectional approach is necessary to ensure that feminist movements empower all women and non-binary individuals without reinforcing harmful stereotypes, marginalising those with different experiences, or inadvertently contributing to their exploitation. And like I've always said, a good feminist movement must also involve men, even if some do seem to be fighting against us at times. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this exploration of Bonnie Blue, Lilly Phillips, the 4B movement, and everything else that's been blowing up online. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and with that, I'll see you soon.